that moment, Elvis the man was sacrificed, and Elvis the God was born.
The gates of Graceland had seen many things, but nothing prepared the security guards for what happened at 2:30 in the afternoon on August 18th, 1977. A black limousine pulled up, and out stepped Frank Sinatra Jr., representing his father, who had once called Elvis's music a deplorable influence on American youth. The guards exchanged nervous glances as they checked their list twice, then 3 times. His name wasn't there, but when Jr. mentioned something only Elvis and his father knew about a private conversation in Vegas, they had no choice but to let him through. What the public didn't know was that Elvis's funeral had become a battleground of unexpected arrivals and old wounds suddenly torn open. The official guest list had been carefully curated by Vernon Presley and Colonel Parker, but by noon, that list had become almost meaningless. 3 different people had already shown up claiming to be Elvis's illegitimate children, each with photographs and letters they swore proved their connection. One woman from Detroit had birth certificates that made Vernon's hands shake, though he refused to let her pass the front door. The security operation resembled something from a presidential summit. Rather than a rock star's funeral, Memphis police had cordoned off entire blocks, but it wasn't enough. They hadn't anticipated the sheer audacity of who would try to attend. Around 1 o'clock, a helicopter landed on a nearby field, and out stepped a figure that made Priscilla Presley's blood run cold. It was someone from Elvis's past. Someone he'd sworn on his mother's grave he would never speak to again after a betrayal that had cost him millions and nearly destroyed his career in 1971. The tension inside Graceland was already suffocating before this person arrived. Priscilla had been managing a delicate dance all morning, keeping Linda Thompson in the East Wing, while Ginger Alden remained upstairs, each woman claiming their own version of grief and their right to be closest to Elvis's memory. But when Anne Margaret arrived with tears streaming down her face, the entire dynamic shifted. These weren't just former lovers gathering to mourn. They were women who each held pieces of Elvis's heart, now forced to share the same space while the world watched. The real shock came when Red West walked through the door. Red, who had been fired by Elvis just a year earlier along with Sonny West and Dave Hebler, and who had just published a tell-all book that devastated Elvis in his final weeks. The room went silent as Red approached the casket, his face a mask of regret and something deeper, something that looked like genuine devastation. When he began to speak, his voice cracked as he talked about the boy from Tupelo he'd protected in high school, long before the world knew Elvis's name. By the end, even those who wanted to throw him out were wiping their eyes. Colonel Parker tried to maintain control, but the situation was spiraling beyond anyone's management. Word had somehow leaked to people Elvis had touched throughout his life, and they came like moths to a flame. A woman from Germany showed up with photographs from his army days that nobody had ever seen. A Native American chief from Arizona arrived to honor what he called a blood brother ceremony Elvis had participated in during the filming of Stay Away Joe, though the studio had no record of such an event. But it was the woman in black who unsettled everyone the most. She appeared just as the service was beginning, wearing a veil that completely obscured her face. She knew things about Elvis that even his closest friends didn't know, mentioning a scar on his shoulder from a childhood accident that Gladys had kept secret, whispering about a song he'd written but never recorded that only he and one other person knew existed. She placed a single white rose on the casket with a note that made Vernon Presley stagger backward when he read it. Yet before anyone could question her, she vanished into the crowd of mourners, leaving only questions and a lingering scent of jasmine, the perfume Gladys had worn. Some swore they saw her lips moving in prayer, speaking words in a language that sounded ancient, almost otherworldly, as if she was performing some kind of final ritual that Elvis himself had requested. The atmosphere at Graceland shifted palpably when Tom Diskin, Colonel Parker's right-hand man, whispered urgently in his ear. Outside the gates, a silver Cadillac had just pulled up, carrying someone nobody expected to see. It was the man Elvis had publicly humiliated during a Las Vegas show in 1973, calling him a bloodsucker and a parasite in front of 3,000 people. Yet here was this Nashville executive holding an arrangement of blue carnations that must have cost more than most people's monthly salary, asking to pay his respects to the man who had tried to destroy his career. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew the history. This same executive had once blocked Elvis from recording at certain studios, claiming his presence would corrupt the pure country sound. Now he stood in the August heat, his expensive suit wilting, waiting for permission to enter the home of the man he'd tried to blacklist. When Vernon finally nodded his approval, the executive walked in with his head down, placing the flowers carefully near the casket before breaking down completely, his sobs echoing through the room like a confession. Even more shocking was the arrival of Eddie Bond, the band leader who had rejected Elvis in 1954 and telling the young truck driver he'd never make it as a singer and should stick to driving. Bond had spent years watching the kid he'd dismissed become the biggest star in the world, and the weight of that mistake had clearly haunted him. He approached the casket slowly, as if each step was an admission of the opportunity he'd thrown away. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, apologizing to a man who could no longer hear him for being too blind to see what everyone else eventually saw. The Memphis Mafia members, who'd been excommunicated, created their own drama. Lamar Fike had been let go after a bitter argument about money, and Dave Hebler had been fired for what Elvis called disloyalty. Yet both men pushed through the crowds, their faces etched with a grief that transcended their falling out. When Hebler reached the casket, and he pulled out a small leather book, placing it gently beside Elvis. It was Elvis's personal phone directory from 1968, something Hebler had kept all these years, filled with numbers of people Elvis had helped secretly, people whose medical bills he'd paid, or whose homes he'd saved from foreclosure. The tension reached a crescendo when Albert Goldman arrived. The journalist had written some of the most vicious reviews of Elvis's performances, calling him a grotesque caricature of his former self and suggesting he should retire before he embarrassed himself further. Security moved to intercept him, but Goldman held up a letter, his hands trembling. It was something Elvis had written to him but never sent, found in a hotel room in Vegas. In it, Elvis had thanked Goldman for his harsh words and saying they'd motivated him to try harder, to prove he still had something left to give. Goldman read it aloud through tears, his voice breaking on Elvis's closing words about forgiveness and understanding. Perhaps the most unexpected visitors were the law enforcement officials who had once pursued Elvis with dedication bordering on obsession. A DEA agent from Washington arrived with a partner, both men who had investigated Elvis's prescription drug connections. They stood at the back, their badges hidden, their heads bowed. One of them later admitted they'd come to realize Elvis wasn't a criminal, but a victim of a system that had failed to protect him from himself and the doctors who enabled his dependencies. Now, the local Memphis police captain, who had once threatened to arrest Elvis for inciting a riot during a 1956 show, stood near the window, staring at nothing. He'd brought his grandson's Elvis album, hoping somehow to get it signed, not fully grasping that the man who could sign it was gone. When someone gently reminded him, he clutched the album to his chest and wept like a child, mourning not just Elvis, but the realization that he'd spent years trying to silence a voice that had brought joy to millions, including his own family. The air in Graceland's main parlor could have been cut with a knife when Anne Margaret entered through the east entrance at the exact moment Linda Thompson was descending the main staircase. For a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, both women froze, and their eyes meeting across the space where Elvis had once played his piano late into the night. The unspoken history between them filled the room like smoke. Anne Margaret, the co-star who had nearly become Mrs. Presley, and Linda, who had spent 4 years trying to save Elvis from himself, now shared the same grief-stricken air. Priscilla had orchestrated the morning like a careful ballet, timing arrivals and managing spaces to keep certain women from crossing paths. But grief has a way of destroying even the best-laid plans. When Ginger Alden emerged from the bathroom, where she'd been crying for 20 minutes, she found herself face-to-face with the woman Elvis had called the love of his life during a drug confession just 3 months earlier. The problem was, he'd said it to Ginger about Linda. while Ginger was wearing the engagement ring he'd given her. The careful choreography shattered completely when a taxi pulled up and out stepped a woman nobody had seen in over 20 years. Dixie Locke, Elvis's first real love from Humes High School, had driven all night from Mississippi. Her hair was gray now, her face lined with years Elvis hadn't been part of. But when Vernon saw her, his composure finally cracked. This was the girl his son had wanted to marry before fame swept him away, the one Gladys had hoped would keep her boy grounded. Dixie moved through the room like a ghost from a simpler time when Elvis was just a kid with a guitar and a dream. The situation became explosive when a young backup singer named Kathy Westmoreland was intercepted at the door by security. She was hysterical, claiming she had something urgent to tell the family, something about Elvis's final wishes that only she knew. When they tried to turn her away, she screamed loud enough for everyone to hear that she was carrying Elvis's child. The room went silent, except for the sound of Priscilla's sharp intake of breath. It was Ginger who surprised everyone by walking over and taking Kathy's hand, leading her to a quiet corner where they could talk, woman to woman, about the man they'd both loved. What happened next defied every expectation and social protocol. As the afternoon wore on, these women who should have been rivals began to gravitate toward each other. Linda found herself comforting Anne Margaret, sharing stories about Elvis's nightmares and how they'd both tried to ease them. Priscilla and Dixie sat together on a couch, looking through old photographs that Dixie had brought, images of Elvis before the world claimed him. Even Ginger, the newest and most insecure of Elvis's loves, found herself drawn into this strange sisterhood of grief. The moment that broke, everyone came when Joyce Bova, a woman Elvis had dated secretly in the early 70s, arrived with a small boy who looked startlingly like Elvis had as a child. She didn't claim the boy was his, but she didn't deny it either. She simply placed a white rose on the casket with a note that made Vernon go pale when he read it. The note contained lyrics to a song Elvis had written for her but never recorded, words about a love that couldn't be acknowledged but would never die. As the sun began to set, something extraordinary happened, and all the women who had loved Elvis Aaron Presley stood together near his casket, not as rivals, but as keepers of different chapters of his story. Priscilla held Linda's hand, who held Anne Margaret's, who had her arm around Ginger, creating a chain of shared loss that transcended jealousy or competition. In death, Elvis had somehow managed to bring together the women he'd kept carefully apart in life, and in their shared tears, they found something none of them had expected to find in that room full of flowers and sorrow. They found understanding. The heavy oak doors of Graceland's music room suddenly swung open at 4:17 in the afternoon, and in walked a man whose very existence the Presley family had spent decades denying. Jesse Garon Presley, or at least that's what he called himself. He stood there claiming to be not Elvis's twin, who died at birth, but an illegitimate half-brother Vernon had fathered during a brief separation from Gladys in 1948. He carried documents, photographs, and a birth certificate from a small town in Alabama that made Vernon's knees buckle. The resemblance was undeniable, those same hooded eyes, that crooked smile, even the way he stood with his weight shifted to one leg. The room erupted in chaos as family members tried to process what they were seeing. This man had letters from Gladys, written in her distinctive handwriting, talking about the son Vernon had never claimed. He knew things about the family that no outsider could know, like the pet name Gladys called Vernon when they were alone, and the story about Elvis's first guitar that had been told differently to the public. When he spoke, his voice carried that same Mississippi drawl, softened by years, but unmistakably Presley. Before anyone could fully absorb this revelation, another shockwave hit. A diplomatic car with German plates pulled up, and out stepped a woman in her 50s who looked like European royalty because she was. Princess Elizabeth of Yugoslavia had flown in secretly, revealing a romance with Elvis during his army years that had been covered up by both governments. She carried love letters Elvis had written, comparing her to Grace Kelly, but saying she was more beautiful because she was real, not a movie star playing a part. And the State Department had apparently threatened Elvis with charges of compromising national security if he pursued the relationship. The international presence didn't stop there. a delegation from Japan arrived with a translator representing a Buddhist temple where Elvis had secretly studied during a spiritual crisis in 1972. They claimed Elvis had taken vows and been given a spiritual name, and they'd come to perform last rites according to their tradition. Colonel Parker went white when he saw them, realizing Elvis had hidden entire portions of his life, even from his manager. Then came the civil rights leaders, whose presence shocked both the mourners and the media outside. Ralph Abernathy arrived despite criticism from some in his community who felt Elvis had appropriated black culture. But Abernathy carried a different story, one about Elvis secretly funding voter registration drives in Mississippi and paying legal fees for arrested protesters. He spoke about late-night phone calls where Elvis, torn between his Southern upbringing and his conscience, had asked how he could help without endangering the movement by making it about himself. The FBI presence was perhaps the most surreal element. 3 agents arrived not on duty, but as mourners, revealing that Elvis had been secretly working with them since 1970, not as an informant, but as someone who helped identify potential threats at his concerts. One agent broke protocol entirely, admitting that Elvis had saved his daughter's life by paying for experimental cancer treatment when government insurance wouldn't cover it. They'd come to honor a man who'd been more patriot than anyone knew. The afternoon's most dramatic moment came when a lawyer nobody recognized stood up during a quiet moment and announced he had been instructed to read something only upon Elvis's death. He produced a sealed envelope that had been in a safety deposit box since 1969. Inside was Elvis's real will, different from the official one, leaving specific items to people nobody had heard of. A guitar to a homeless veteran in Memphis who'd taught him a chord progression. Money for the education of children whose parents had died in Vietnam. A Cadillac to the maid who'd cleaned Graceland's bathrooms without complaint for 15 years. But the revelation that changed everything came from an elderly black woman who'd ridden a Greyhound bus for 2 days from Detroit. And she told the story of how Elvis had found her son on Beale Street in 1956, overdosing on heroin, and had personally driven him to a hospital, paid for his treatment, then funded his recovery and education. That son was now a doctor in Michigan, saving lives because a young Elvis Presley had saved his. She'd never told anyone, because Elvis had made her promise, saying he didn't want credit for doing what any decent person would do. As the sun set on this extraordinary day in Memphis, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns of Graceland, the assembled mourners began to disperse, each carrying their own private memories of the man they'd come to honor. But the guest list at Elvis Presley's funeral had revealed something profound and unexpected, something that would take years for historians and biographers to fully comprehend and appreciate. The King of Rock and Roll had lived not one life, but multiple lives running parallel to each other, each authentic and meaningful in its own way. There was the public Elvis, the performer and celebrity known to millions, but there were also the private Elvises, the secret benefactor who funded strangers' medical treatments, the anonymous donor who paid off mortgages for families facing foreclosure, the quiet friend who showed up unannounced to comfort people in their darkest hours, the spiritual seeker who studied comparative religion and philosophy in search of deeper meaning. And he had touched souls across continents and cultures in ways that went far beyond his music and films. Among the mourners were people whose lives Elvis had transformed through acts of kindness that were never publicized or acknowledged. There were individuals he'd met once and never forgot, people he'd helped without any expectation of recognition or gratitude, connections forged in moments of genuine human empathy that transcended his celebrity status. And he had kept secrets, so many secrets, that would have enhanced rather than diminished his legend if he'd only allowed them to be told during his lifetime. Acts of extraordinary generosity that he insisted remain anonymous. Friendships with people from backgrounds and communities that crossed the social boundaries of his era. And spiritual beliefs that were more nuanced and thoughtful than the simple faith his public image suggested. Creative ambitions and unfulfilled dreams that revealed depths of artistic vision his handlers never allowed him to fully explore. In death, all these hidden connections surfaced simultaneously, converging at Graceland like tributaries flowing into a river. The eclectic assembly of mourners, famous and unknown, wealthy and struggling, expected and completely surprising, painted a picture of a man far more complex, compassionate, and multifaceted than even his most devoted fans had imagined during his lifetime. The gospel singers who'd inspired his earliest musical awakening stood beside Hollywood stars. Childhood friends from Tupelo's poverty shared space with international dignitaries. The woman whose son's cancer treatment Elvis had quietly funded wept alongside the musicians who'd played on his greatest recordings. Civil rights activists, whose work he'd supported through anonymous donations, mourned near the Memphis Mafia members who'd traveled the world with him. Each person present represented a different facet of Elvis's character, a different room in the vast mansion of his personality. Together they formed a mosaic that was far richer and more beautiful than any single biography or documentary could capture. The funeral wasn't just a farewell to an entertainer, it was the revelation of a secret history, the unveiling of a man who deliberately kept the best parts of himself hidden from public view. Elvis Presley had understood something fundamental about fame, that true goodness requires privacy, that authentic compassion cannot coexist with publicity seeking, and that the most meaningful connections happen away from cameras and headlines. His funeral proved that he'd lived according to these principles, creating a legacy of kindness that was finally, inevitably, brought into the light by the very event that marked his passing.